So each item card or item record, we'll use those terms synonymously, is going to contain essential information. So in essence, when you go into a software program that has MRP capabilities for a specific item, you're going to see fields that are identical to each bullet point that we're talking about now. And you can start to see the level of detail on a specific component raw material level that goes into that MRP function. So first and foremost, first bullet point, the item name, what is it? Its product description. Item number, how we in our organization identify a product. And also something we haven't mentioned yet, the harmonized system number. Our company-specific number or our vendor-specific number that identifies a product, that's one thing. That's between ourselves and our vendor. The harmonized system is part of a globally recognized numerical nomenclature that helps countries and companies and customs entities identify and classify products. So on a global scale, there are upwards of about 200 countries around the world through the World Customs Organization that participate in the harmonized system. So when we classify products, be it a smartphone or a vacuum cleaner or whatever it might be, countries around the world, based on the product description, the first 6 numbers of the classification are going to be the same. They're going to be harmonized. And it just makes it easier to identify and ultimately move goods around the world. So that's what we mean by the harmonized system. Next bullet point, who's the vendor or vendors that sell us a particular raw material? What's the unit cost? Not our landed cost, but what's our unit cost at the door of the vendor? What's the unit of measure? It could be a single per unit scenario. It could be by the dozen for socks. It could be by the kilo for precious metals. It could be any variety of things. Liters for chemicals. We need a unit of measure. We also need stock locations. So if we're in a situation where we're a global manufacturer and we have factories in 6 places around the world, we need to know where this particular raw material is being stocked. Where is it? We'll also need to know its inventory classification, what's referred to as ABC. ABC classification allows us to prioritize the level of attention that we pay to a given item. Is it a high-use item? Is it a high-value item? Is it both high-use and high-value? It's just a classification tool for prioritizing how much attention we pay to inventory. We'll get to that during our module on inventory management, but it should be in the item record in the MRP software. Also, usage. What level of historical usage, at least in the recent past, have we seen on this particular item? That should be in your item record. Very important as well, the on-hand balance at each location. We saw how important on-hand balances are when we looked at our MRP item card graphic. So this helps us to bring the importance forward even more. What is the on-hand balance? Maybe it's only at one location, it's only one factory. But if it's more than one, we need to know what is our balance now and projected balance out into the future, as we saw in our MRP graphic, for each item and each location. Amount allocated. It's nice to have raw materials available for production, but we need to know in existing and future periods what amount of, say, 1,000 units has already been allocated to production. We don't want to think that we have 1,000 units available for production when 500 of those have already been allocated. So the MRP software will tell us that. As we also saw in our MRP graphic, we'll have information on order info. What is in the pipeline and when is it due in? Vital for moving forward into the future for MRP planning purposes. When do we reorder? Or at what level of stock do we reorder? Do we wait until we only have 100 pieces left or 1,000 units left before we reorder? And also a term we've not introduced yet and will talk about a lot in our inventory management module is safety stock. Safety stock is additional inventory that we keep, could be for raw materials, could be for finished goods, to take into account random variation in supply chain. It's extra stock laying around, kind of not a just-in-time situation, but a just-in-case situation. What is our order quantity? How much do we reorder? And what is the lead time? And again, we saw that on our item card in our graphic illustration. So all of these points, every single raw material that we deal with in our organization, there's going to be an item card, and that's the level of detail, item record, the level of detail that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to move over now to sales and operations planning, but the integration and synchronization of sell-side activities, as you see in our slide title. We've talked about the buy side, materials management, MRP, gross to net exploding, lead time offsetting, some pretty significant detail. Those were all buy side activities. We're going to switch over to sell side. We've done our production thing, or someone produced on our behalf. Now we're in the distribution network selling product. The good news here is, or part of the good news, is that the concept of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting is very similar. I won't say it's identical, but it's definitely very similar conceptually to how we saw it working on the buy side of things. Figuring out what we're going to need in the future, what do we have now, what do we think we're going to have in each period, what's the net requirement, and when do I have to place an order to make sure it shows up on time. That's really the essence of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. So it is, in a distribution environment, conceptually the same as the buy side. The biggest difference, obviously, being on the buy side, we're dealing with raw materials, whereas on the sell side, distribution management, we're dealing with finished goods and customers, to take into consideration the far right of our slide here. So we're starting to incorporate, to integrate the entire supply chain, bringing together the buy side with the sell side, not only strategically, but now tactically and operationally. So we're on the sell side of things now, so let's move forward. The heart of the tactical matter, distribution requirements planning on the sell side. So first off, we've said this already, DRP, let's call it that, is intended for use with finished goods. It encompasses activities associated with identifying the replenishment requirements of warehouse locations throughout a company's logistics network. So right out of the gate, one of the key integrating factors to ask is, how many warehouses, if any, do we have in our logistics network? That's a really important consideration, but because we're talking about needs at different points in a company's distribution network. Maybe they're our warehouses that we run ourselves. Maybe they're outsourced to a 3PL, but the importance of linking that distribution network and its physical existence to the DRP function, that's one of the first things that we need to do. So DRP, as we said, uses the same logic as MRP because it's time-phased. We're looking out into the future and making adjustments between what we thought was going to happen as a forecast and what is really happening. Same exact concept as MRP, and very much so a part of sales and operations planning because we're updating our activities from what was forecasted to what is actually transpiring and making adjustments accordingly. That's really important to reiterate that point. So that logic, it's time-phased, and it helps us to determine inventory needs for each of an organization's stocking locations. As we said, the number of warehouses in a network. Maybe it's a small satellite warehouse in the Midwest. Maybe it's a regional distribution center in Sparks, Nevada. Maybe it's a master distribution center on the outskirts of Shanghai for your China business. Those are the things that we need to know. Once established, DRP relies upon those principles, gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. What do we need? What are we going to need in future periods? What do we have now? What do we think we're going to have? And how do we go from that gross requirement to a net requirement? Lead time offsetting, same principle, because we have to place orders on the distribution network in a fashion that goods don't show up too late or show up even too early. Sometimes too early shipments are just as bad as too late. So we're synchronizing product quantities and delivery times with actual demand. Because DRP is used by companies with multi-level distribution networks. Again, more than one warehouse, a satellite, a regional DC, a master DC. We use a bill of distribution, not a bill of material, which is that recipe for a product, but a bill of distribution that tells us what facility needs what quantities at what period in time. And we're imploding, not exploding, imploding into our own network time phase requirements from the satellites closest to the customers up through the distribution channel to main distribution centers. Here's where that integrating function between the sell side and the buy side becomes so important. Ideally, companies and their supply chain partners employ cloud-based visibility tools to truly integrate and synchronize all of their sales and operations planning activities. Because ultimately, if we're making changes in DRP, which is a finished goods environment, that's going to trickle back up or cascade back up into master production schedules, into MRP quantities, whether we have to make more product or slow things down and make less product. All that information has to find its way back up the supply chain to either our own manufacturing entities or those of our third-party partners. That's really important to point that out.